Professor, do you swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Anita Faye Hill was born in Lone Tree, Oklahoma on July 30th, 1956. As a great-granddaughter of slaves, she knew she had to work extra hard to earn the same opportunities that others were given. She became the valedictorian at Morris High School as a result of her hard work. In 1977, she graduated from Oklahoma University with a degree in psychology, and 3 years later she earned a Juris degree with honors from Yale Law School. That same year, Hill became part of the District of Columbia Bar. She then became a law associate at Wald, Hardricker, and Ross. In 1981, she became attorney advisor to the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education, Clarence Thomas.
Hill met Thomas through a mutual friend. Thomas asked her to be his assistant after he was appointed as Assistant Secretary of Education for Civil Rights in the early 1980s. They worked well together for the first 3 months, but then, according to Hill, things took a turn for the worse. Hill claims that Thomas pressured her to go out with him in public, which she declined every time. She also said that he made inappropriate comments towards her in the office, first when he was the Assistant Secretary of Education and when she continued working for him after his move to chairman of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC. He also allegedly began to use work situations to talk about inappropriate topics. According to Hill, he discussed pornographic material involving animals and rape, as well as his personal prowess. Hill's work relationship with Thomas ended when she accepted an offer to teach at Oral Roberts. According to her, he asked her to dinner one more time before she left. She declined, and he covered himself by calling it a professional courtesy. He allegedly referenced his behavior once when Hill left and said that if she ever told anyone about his behavior, it would ruin him. It wasn't an apology or an explanation for his actions.
In 1991, Thurgood Marshall, the first African American to be appointed to the Supreme Court, retired, and Clarence Thomas was nominated by President Bush to take his place. He wasn't regarded as well qualified, and many suspected he was nominated just to uphold the Supreme Court's diversity and to get another conservative justice, although Bush said that Thomas's race had nothing to do with his decision. Thomas's nomination posed a dilemma to Hill. Should she stay silent and allow this man serve on the highest court in the land, or should she speak out and risk massive scrutiny and further harassment from the press? Ultimately, Hill listened to her gut and chose to do the latter. On October 11, 1991, Anita Hill testified before the Senate.
What happened next and telling the world about it are the two most difficult experiences of my life. It is only after a great deal of agonizing consideration and great number of sleepless nights that I am able to talk of these unpleasant matters.
She relayed the inappropriate remarks and questions Thomas directed to her during her time at the EEOC, including the infamous incident of the Coke can. She spoke calmly and patiently for 8 hours.
We go to lunch to a government cafeteria. After a brief discussion of work, he would turn the conversation to a discussion of sexual matters. His conversations were very vivid. He spoke about acts that he had seen in pornographic films involving such matters as women having sex with animals and films showing group sex or rape scenes.
October 12th, Thomas was questioned about the allegations. He maintained that Hill was only stereotyping him as a black man by saying he was sexually aggressive. Senator Orrin Hatch said that Hill's allegations were stolen from the movie The Exorcist and from a Kansas federal court case.
Sighed Sharon. In a guarded tone, she described an encounter between the senator and the director. Dennings had remarked to him in passing, said Sharon, that there appeared to be, quote, an alien pubic hair floating around in my gin, unquote.
On the third day, Hill's representative said that she had passed a lie detector test, but a friend of Clarence Thomas's from law school, John N. Doggett III, claimed that Hill was mentally unstable and therefore the test was unreliable and its results had no bearing on the case.
Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, as I knew them back then, were good, decent, bright, committed people. And it is hard for me to be here knowing that one of them has to be destroyed if our nation is to be saved.
The hearing finally ended around 2 a.m. on October 14th. The next day, the Senate voted to confirm Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court by a margin of 52-48, which was the narrowest margin in over 100 years.
Lady who creeped out of the woodwork for all of a sudden from out of nowhere. It's to me like a hunt and peck game. I wouldn't even be surprised if someone paid her to make these accusations.
Well, I figure that he's just a black man trying to make it good. And now that he's up here, a lot of things from the past that may or may not have happened are coming out. And I don't think he's guilty at all.
The impact of the Anita Hill case began that very same year when Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which provided damages for sexual harassment-related injuries in the workplace and gave victims the right to a trial by peer jury. Anti-harassment policies and company training programs also became far more thorough and common, and sexual harassment claims at the EEOC more than doubled between 1991 and 1998 as victims became inspired by Hill to come forward. In 1992, 4 women were elected to the Senate and 28 to the House of Representatives in the so-called Year of the Woman. It's clear that women were fed up with Hill's treatment during the case and wanted to prevent the same thing from happening again. The #MeToo movement, though it began 26 years after Hill's testimony, was largely inspired by her bravery and patience. It involved millions of victims of sexual harassment and assault coming forward about the abuse they'd experienced, whether at the hands of high-profile Hollywood celebrities like Harvey Weinstein or Kevin Spacey, or on a smaller scale. Many of these incidents, high or low profile, took place in the workplace, just like Hill's did. Finally, in 2018, Brett Kavanaugh was publicly accused of sexual assault by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford and 2 other women after his nomination to the Supreme Court. Ford, like Hill, testified before the Senate Judicial Committee. Like Hill, she was ridiculed, humiliated, and insulted by those who didn't believe her, and she even had to move out of her home after receiving multiple death threats. These weren't the only ways Kavanaugh's case mirrored Thomas's, though. Even after 27 years, after the #MeToo movement, even with many more women in the Senate, Justice Kavanaugh was still confirmed. This shows that even though we've certainly come a long way in terms of handling sexual harassment since Anita Hill's testimony, we still have a long way to go.
Hill's decision to speak up was a triumph for women everywhere, as the silence on these issues had been broken. Her awful treatment and the overall divisiveness and shame of the hearings were tragedies because they showed how far people would go to protect perpetrators in positions of power, as well as how reluctant they were to believe victims. Despite this, Hill's testimony did play a large part in uniting and empowering minorities. 1,600 black women took out a New York Times ad in support of her in 1991, and the fact that Hill was part of such a high-profile case meant that the word of a black woman was the most talked about thing in America at the time. Similarly, the following Year of the Woman was a triumph because a record number of women ran for Congress and more victims of sexual harassment began to come forward, inspired by Hill's courage. Decades later, the #MeToo movement was also a triumph because largely thanks to Hill, millions of people began to come forward about the abuse they had suffered, just as Hill had. In 2018, the Brett Kavanaugh case was a tragedy because just like in Thomas's case, the hearings were a great source of shame, political division, and anger for America. He was elected despite allegations of sexual misconduct, and his main accuser, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, was harassed, disbelieved, and threatened repeatedly. This again shows that even though we have come a long way, victims are still treated badly and our system still makes for divisive and controversial cases. Hopefully nothing like the Anita Hill case will ever happen again, but if it does, we'll have learned enough from both her and Dr. Ford to end it in a triumph rather than a tragedy.